Andrea Mason stood in the crowded courtroom feeling the weight of the room pressing down on her. Though she kept her expression neutral, she could feel the eyes of everyone on her, especially the judge, his eyes scanning her attire. Before his gaze shifted to the papers in front of him, Charles Thompson, the judge known for his strict, no-nonsense demeanor, didn't even bother to look up from the file. When Andrea was called to the stand, she walked forward with a quiet confidence, her heels clicking on the hard floor beneath her. She was used to the stares, the assumptions that people made when they saw her, a black woman, dressed simply yet poised. She had grown accustomed to being underestimated for years, but she knew how to navigate the world in ways many couldn't imagine. Even as the judge barely acknowledged her existence, she held her head high. Judge Thompson didn't like to be interrupted, and he didn't like excuses. He had seen too many cases of people trying to wriggle out of responsibility by offering flimsy justifications. So when Andrea explained that she was late because she had a charity event to attend, he barely flinched. His mind was already made up in his eyes. Her charity event meant nothing. Her reason for being late was just another excuse from someone who didn't care about following the rules. He didn't care about the fine details of her life. What mattered was her infraction and how he could maintain order in his courtroom, which meant exacting the fine without hesitation. The judge's voice was stern as he looked up, finally meeting her eyes for the first time in the entire proceeding. "You should know better than to disregard the law," he said, his words cold and final. Andrea looked back at him, calm and composed, but inside her mind raced. She had hoped for some understanding, for a little leniency. But there was none in his eyes. There was no empathy, no recognition of who she was beyond the defendants standing before him. To him, she was just another case, just another face in the crowd, someone to be judged and fined without thought or care. He rattled off the amount of the fine with the same impersonal tone he used for every other case, his eyes moving to the next person waiting for their turn. Andrea stood there for a moment longer, as if processing the finality of it. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to be so quick, so sure of himself, so dismissive. And for a brief moment, she wondered if it had anything to do with her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the judgment was somehow influenced by the color of her skin, the way she was dressed, the way he saw her as just another person who didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But she wasn't going to fight him in this courtroom. Not today, not like this. She nodded quietly, accepting the fine, and turned to leave without a word. The sound of her footsteps was drowned out by the shuffle of papers and the next case being called. But inside her, she felt something stir, not anger, but something else, something deeper, a resolve to prove that there was more to her than what the judge had seen, more than what anyone could assume at first glance. She wasn't going to let this moment define her, not when there was so much more waiting ahead. Judge Charles Thompson leaned back in his chair as he sifted through the pile of case files in front of him, one after another. He had been a judge for over 20 years and had developed a sharp, almost instinctual sense of how things would play out in his courtroom. He had a reputation for being tough but fair, a stickler for rules, and someone who expected personal responsibility from those who entered his domain. He didn't tolerate excuses, didn't believe in second chances for people who couldn't even follow the simplest of laws. His courtroom was his kingdom, and order reigned supreme. When Andrea Mason had walked in, he had sized her up in an instant. A woman in her 30s, neatly dressed, but with nothing that stood out to make her special, certainly not the type who would make waves or stand out in any other way. Her clothes were simple, a navy blue blouse and black slacks, not the attire of someone trying to impress or draw attention. Just an ordinary person, he thought. Her explanation for being late had been weak in his eyes. She had been running late for a charity event, she claimed. But to Judge Thompson, that was just another excuse, another way for people to justify their actions. He had seen it before, countless times. The rich, the poor, the powerful, and the powerless, all of them had some reason why they couldn't follow the rules. What struck him most was her demeanor. She didn't argue, didn't try to explain herself further or beg for leniency. She just stood there, calm and composed. That didn't make sense to him. Most defendants fidgeted nervously, pleaded for sympathy, or tried to talk their way out of trouble. But Andrea didn't seem to care. Her quiet confidence, her peaceful nature, it made him uncomfortable. And perhaps because of that discomfort, he dismissed her explanation even more. In his mind, people like her didn't deserve special treatment. She was like everyone else, wasn't she? Another person who had made a mistake and needed to face the consequences. Judge Thompson's decision was swift, his tone unyielding. The fine would stand. She would pay like anyone else who broke the law. His gavel hit the block, sealing the verdict, and Andrea quietly nodded in acceptance. She wasn't upset, at least not outwardly, and that made him even more certain of his ruling. If she wasn't bothered by the fine, it meant it wasn't a big deal to her, right? Maybe she could afford it, and that thought made him feel justified. It wasn't about the money, it was about enforcing the rules, about keeping order. That's what mattered most. As the court session continued, Judge Thompson went through the motions with his usual precision. The cases blended together in a blur, each one a routine process for him. He thought little of Andrea's case once it was over. He didn't even think of her as he moved on to the next defendant, who was there for a more serious matter. But the thing about assumptions is that they often mask the truth. And the truth about Andrea Mason, the woman he had dismissed with such ease, was something he couldn't have imagined, something he wouldn't have believed even if someone had told him. He would soon learn that his quick judgment, based on her outward appearance and the simple, unremarkable reasons she gave, had been profoundly wrong. But for now, life in his courtroom continued, and Andrea Mason was just another name in his case files, a name he wouldn't forget for long, though he didn't know it yet. It was late in the evening when Judge Charles Thompson stumbled upon the article. He was at home, his glass of scotch sitting untouched on the coffee table, the soft hum of the city outside barely reaching his ears. The day had been long, filled with the usual parade of cases, each one blurring into the next. His thoughts drifted to the earlier case, the woman he had fined without a second thought, Andrea Mason. The name lingered in his mind like a distant echo, an anomaly in a day full of routine. Then, as he scrolled through his tablet, an article headline caught his attention. Asterisk Andrea Mason, self-made billionaire behind revolutionary tech startups, asterisk. His eyes narrowed. It couldn't be the same person, could it? He clicked on the link, his curiosity piqued despite himself. The story unfolded before him, and what he read stopped him dead in his tracks. Andrea Mason, the same woman he had fined so casually earlier that day, was one of the wealthiest and most influential entrepreneurs in the world, a self-made billionaire. She had built an empire in the tech world, founding multiple startups in the fields of artificial intelligence and sustainable energy, industries that were reshaping the future. Not only had she achieved incredible financial success, but she was also a powerful advocate for social justice, pouring millions into organizations dedicated to improving education, healthcare, and racial equality. Judge Thompson stared at the words, disbelief taking root in his chest. He couldn't reconcile the woman he had seen in the courtroom with the one described in the article. The Andrea Mason he had encountered that afternoon hadn't appeared anything like this. She had been calm, composed, and understated. Nothing about her indicated she was a billionaire. She was just another defendant, in his mind, an ordinary person who had made a simple mistake. As he read on, he learned more about her journey. Andrea had grown up in a working-class neighborhood, facing hardships that many would find insurmountable. She had worked tirelessly through college, determined to succeed where so many others had failed. Her story wasn't one of privilege, but of struggle and perseverance, defying the odds stacked against her. She had faced systemic racism and sexism at every turn, but instead of letting those challenges break her, she had used them as fuel to build something extraordinary. Thompson felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the reality of his mistake began to sink in. How had he missed it? How had he not recognized the depth of her success, the breadth of her influence? His judgment had been swift, based on assumptions and appearances, assumptions that had led him to treat Andrea Mason like just another ordinary person, someone who didn't matter beyond her traffic violation. And now, seeing her story laid bare, he realized how wrong he had been. It wasn't just the fact that she was a billionaire that stunned him. It was the way he had dismissed her. His quick judgment, rooted in biases he had never fully examined, had led him to make a decision that was based entirely on the surface, ignoring the substance of who she really was. He had assumed that because she was dressed simply and spoke politely, she was like the many others he saw in his courtroom, a person with limited means and little influence. But Andrea Mason was not like anyone he had ever encountered before. She had worked for everything she had, and now, through her wealth, she was changing the world. Judge Thompson sat back, a sense of shame beginning to wash over him. The woman he had fined for a simple traffic violation wasn't just another case. She was a force, and he had been blind to it. The story wasn't just about Andrea anymore. It was about him too, about his own limitations and the narrow view of the world he had cultivated over years of sitting in that courtroom. He didn't know it yet, but his life and his understanding of justice was about to change forever. The more Judge Thompson delved into Andrea Mason's life, the more he realized how little he had understood. His initial reaction to her in the courtroom had been based on the surface, the clothes she wore, the quiet confidence in her demeanor, the absence of any attempt to justify herself beyond a simple explanation. Now, sitting in the quiet of his study, scrolling through article after article, he felt a deep unease gnaw at him. He discovered that Andrea's path to success wasn't a smooth one, nor had it been handed to her on a silver platter. Growing up in a tough neighborhood, Andrea had faced more challenges than most people could imagine. She was raised by a single mother, one who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, yet still struggled to keep food on the table. From a young age, Andrea had been acutely aware of the obstacles that stood in her way: poverty, racism, and the limited opportunities available to someone like her. But instead of succumbing to these barriers, she had become determined to break through them. Judge Thompson read about Andrea's early years in school, where she excelled despite the systemic obstacles she faced. Teachers had often underestimated her, assuming she wasn't capable of achieving much. But Andrea, with a fierce determination, proved them wrong. She had been the first in her family to graduate from college, and not just any college, one of the top schools in the country. Yet, despite her academic success, the doors of the corporate world remained largely closed to her, a victim of both racial and gender biases. And that's where her entrepreneurial spirit had come into play. Rather than accept the limitations that society had placed on her, Andrea had built her own way. She had started her first tech company with little more than a laptop, a loan from her mother, and an idea that people had told her would never work. The company grew, slowly at first, until it began to gain traction in the world of artificial intelligence, a field dominated by white men in expensive suits. But Andrea, with her relentless focus and innovative approach, had disrupted that industry, bringing fresh perspectives and ideas to a space that had sorely lacked diversity. Judge Thompson couldn't help but feel embarrassed as he read about her success. How had he not seen it? How had he missed the story of a woman who had fought tooth and nail for every step she had gained? The person he had dismissed so easily in the courtroom wasn't just another traffic violator. She was a visionary, a self-made billionaire who had changed entire industries. His discomfort grew as he read on, learning about the extensive philanthropic work Andrea had done. She had donated millions to causes that focused on education, healthcare, and racial equality. She had funded scholarships for young people in underserved communities, many of whom had backgrounds similar to hers. She had established initiatives to address systemic racism in the tech world, pushing for more inclusive practices and more opportunities for people of color. She wasn't just wealthy, she was making a difference. As Judge Thompson read through the details of Andrea's work, he began to feel the full weight of his mistake. His quick judgment had been based on assumptions that were both unfair and uninformed. He had seen Andrea as just another person in his courtroom, someone who didn't deserve special treatment. He hadn't taken the time to consider that, beyond the surface, there was so much more to her. A woman whose wealth and influence were not the result of privilege, but of grit, intelligence, and resilience. His own biases had clouded his judgment, and he now felt the sting of his error. He realized that Andrea's success wasn't just about the wealth she had accumulated. It was about the path she had carved for herself, despite the countless people who had told her no. despite the countless systems that had worked against her. He had been wrong. And that truth was beginning to settle in, heavy and uncomfortable, in the pit of his stomach. As he closed his tablet and sat back in his chair, a thought crept into his mind. How many others had he misjudged in his career? How many others had he dismissed based on assumptions that were as flawed as his own? He had spent years sitting in judgment of others, but now he was beginning to see that the greatest judgment he needed to face was his own. Judge Thompson could not stop thinking about Andrea Mason. After spending the entire evening reading everything he could find about her, his mind was flooded with guilt and regret. He felt an undeniable sense of shame, not just for how he had treated her in the courtroom, but for the way his entire life had been shaped by biases he had never questioned. He had always believed that his role as a judge meant he was impartial, that his decisions were based on logic and the law. But now, as the weight of his mistake hung heavily over him, he realized that what he thought was fairness had, in fact, been clouded by prejudice. The following day, Thompson went to work with a sense of unease that he hadn't felt in years. As he entered his courtroom, the familiar sound of the gavel and the shuffle of papers should have reassured him, but instead, they made him feel disconnected, as if everything around him was moving on without him. He went through the motions of the day, calling cases, hearing arguments, passing judgments, but it felt hollow. His thoughts kept returning to Andrea, to her story, and to how he had let something so simple, a late arrival, distract him from seeing who she really was. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had missed something important, that perhaps this was more than just an ordinary mistake. Maybe this was a moment of awakening. The court session was almost over when the thought occurred to him. He could reach out to Andrea Mason. He had the power to correct his wrong, to make amends. But how could he? How could he approach someone of her stature after dismissing her so thoughtlessly? And yet, something deep inside told him that it was the right thing to do. Judge Thompson spent the rest of the day debating whether he should contact her. He considered the possible consequences. Would she be receptive to his apology, or would she see his attempt as nothing more than a gesture of self-interest, an attempt to ease his guilt? And more importantly, what if she didn't want anything to do with him? What if to her, he was just another person who had tried to hold her back? But as he sat at his desk, thinking about everything he had learned about her, he realized that he needed to do it, for his own integrity, for the sake of justice, and for the lessons that he had so clearly missed all these years. The moment was right. He wrote the letter carefully, choosing his words with caution. He began by acknowledging his mistake, admitting that he had misjudged her based solely on superficial factors, not taking the time to understand who she really was or what she had accomplished. He expressed his deep regret for the way he had treated her, realizing now that his assumptions were not just wrong, but harmful. He apologized for reducing her to nothing more than a simple case in his court. Then he asked if she would be willing to meet with him, to give him the opportunity to apologize in person and perhaps learn from her, something he had failed to do before. He read the letter twice before he sealed it. He felt a little nervous, unsure of what would come next. But in his heart, he knew that this was more than just an apology. It was the beginning of something bigger, a chance for him to grow, to challenge his own assumptions, and to understand the people who came before him in a way he never had before. He needed to do this for his own conscience, but also for the woman whose life he had so thoughtlessly disrupted. After sealing the envelope, he sent it off. As he sat back in his chair, he felt a mix of anticipation and fear. What if Andrea didn't respond? What if his letter, his apology, was too late? But in that moment, he realized that all he could do now was wait and hope that he had done the right thing. Judge Thompson spent the next several days in a quiet turmoil, his mind constantly drifting back to the letter he had sent to Andrea Mason. It was odd, he thought, how something so simple, an apology, could feel like such a monumental decision. He was used to wielding power, making life-altering judgments every day, but this felt different. This wasn't about a legal case. This was personal, and the weight of it was something he hadn't anticipated. Every time he checked his phone, every time he sat at his desk, there was that nagging hope. What if she replied? What if she gave him a chance to make things right? Then, one morning, as he arrived at his office, he found a letter sitting on his desk. It was from Andrea Mason. His heart skipped a beat. He tore open the envelope with trembling hands, unsure of what to expect. The letter inside was handwritten, her neat script clear and deliberate. He took a deep breath and began to read. Asterisk, Dear Judge Thompson, asterisk. Asterisk, thank you for your letter. I appreciate the courage it took to admit your mistake, and I believe you when you say that you've reflected on the way you judged me. We all make mistakes, but it's rare for someone in your position to be open enough to acknowledge when they've been wrong, asterisk. Asterisk, I won't pretend that I wasn't hurt by how quickly you dismissed me in your courtroom. It was jarring, especially considering all the work I've done to break down barriers and challenge systems that often overlook people like me. But I understand that sometimes we all get caught up in the weight of our own perspectives, asterisk. Asterisk, that being said, I think this is an opportunity for something greater than just an apology. I believe in growth. I believe in second chances. And I believe that real change can come when we open ourselves up to learning and evolving, asterisk. Asterisk, I'd be willing to meet with you. Not because I feel sorry for you, but because I think you're sincere in wanting to understand. If you're open to it, I'd be happy to share my story with you in person, and maybe, just maybe, we can both learn from each other, asterisk. Asterisk, kindly asterisk. Asterisk, Andrea Mason, asterisk. Judge Thompson sat back in his chair, the letter still in his hands. It was more than he had expected, more than he had hoped for. The sincerity in her words struck him, not just for her understanding, but for her willingness to offer him a chance to engage with her, to hear her story and learn from it. It was clear that Andrea had a depth of character he had missed in that brief encounter in his courtroom. The simple act of her agreeing to meet was a gift he hadn't anticipated, and he couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and gratitude. He immediately picked up the phone and dialed the number she had provided in the letter. His hands shook slightly as he waited for the line to connect. Hello. Andrea's voice was warm and calm, just as he remembered from the courtroom. Ms. Mason, this is Judge Thompson. Thank you. Thank you for your response. I'm honored that you're willing to meet with me, he said, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. I'm glad to hear that, Judge. It's not every day I get a letter like that. Let's meet. How about next week? The two of them arranged a meeting at a cafe downtown, a neutral place, neither too formal nor too casual. As Thompson hung up the phone, he felt a wave of nervous energy. He had no idea what to expect from the meeting or what Andrea would say. But he did know one thing. This was a turning point. His eyes had been opened, and now he had the chance to learn and grow, to make up for the mistake he had made. For the first time in a long time, Judge Thompson felt hope, not for the courtroom or his work, but for himself. This meeting could be the beginning of something transformative, not just for his career, but for his own understanding of the world around him. He was ready. The day of the meeting arrived quickly, and Judge Thompson found himself pacing nervously in his office. It wasn't often that he felt uncertain. After all, he was a man who had spent his entire career in control, making decisions that affected the lives of others. But today was different. Today, he was the one who needed to listen, to understand, and to open himself to a perspective that was entirely new to him. As he left his office, he tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. The cafe he and Andrea had agreed upon was a small, quiet place nestled between two tall buildings downtown. It wasn't fancy, but it felt warm and welcoming, an unassuming place where conversation could flow freely. He arrived early, hoping to gather his thoughts before she arrived. When Andrea walked in, Thompson barely recognized her at first. It was the same woman he had seen in court, the same calm demeanor, the same quiet confidence. But there was something more about her. She wasn't just a tech billionaire. She wasn't just a philanthropist. She was someone who had carried with her the weight of her experiences, the struggles that had defined her journey, and there was a depth to her presence that he couldn't ignore. Andrea smiled as she spotted him. She was dressed casually, yet still effortlessly poised. Judge Thompson, I'm glad we could meet, she said, extending her hand. Ms. Mason, Thank you for taking the time, he replied, shaking her hand with sincerity. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. Please have a seat. Once they were seated, there was a moment of silence. The awkwardness in the air was palpable. Thompson found himself unsure of where to begin. He had so many questions about her journey, her experiences, her worldview. But it seemed inappropriate to launch into them without first acknowledging the gravity of the situation. I want to start by apologizing again, he said, his voice firm but genuine. I don't just regret the decision I made in court. I regret the way I saw you. I saw the surface and not the substance, and that was my mistake. I misjudged you in the worst possible way. Andrea nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his with understanding. I appreciate you saying that, Judge. Honestly, I didn't expect this to go the way it has, but I'm glad you're here, willing to listen. I think that's a step in the right direction. Thompson paused, trying to collect his thoughts. I've been thinking a lot about what I missed, about how I've approached my work all these years. I've always prided myself on being fair, on being impartial, but it's clear to me now that I've let my own biases cloud my judgment. And worse, I've dismissed people like you, people who fought against so much without even knowing it. Andrea took a deep breath, her expression calm. You're not the first, Judge. You're not the first person to judge me based on what they see. But that's something I've had to live with my entire life. It's not just about being a black woman in a world that wasn't built for me. It's about constantly being underestimated, constantly having to prove that I'm more than what people see. Thompson was struck by the weight of her words. He had never considered what it must be like to live in a world where your worth was constantly questioned, where every achievement was met with skepticism simply because of who you were. The realization stung. How many times had he dismissed others in the same way? How many times had he allowed his own assumptions to shape his decisions? Andrea continued, her voice steady. I didn't get to where I am by playing it safe, by accepting the limitations people imposed on me. I had to build my own path, fight for my place in spaces that didn't want me there. And that's what I hope people understand. When you fought as hard as I have to be seen, to be heard, you don't let someone like you, someone with the power to change lives, dismiss you without taking a second look. The words landed on Thompson like a thunderclap, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly humbled. Andrea wasn't just a story of success against the odds. She was a symbol of resilience, of the countless people who had been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed by a system that favored the privileged. I've been so blind, Thompson whispered. I never understood how deep the struggle was, how much strength it takes just to survive in a world that doesn't see you for who you really are. Andrea gave him a small, understanding smile. It's not too late to see, Judge. It's never too late to learn, to change. I'm here today because I believe we can all do better. And I think you can too. As the conversation continued, Thompson realized that this meeting, this exchange, wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about beginning a new chapter, one where he could challenge his own perceptions, listen more carefully, and understand that true justice didn't just lie in following the law. It lay in seeing people for who they truly were, beyond the surface, beyond the assumptions. This was the turning point, not just in his career, but in his life. He left that cafe with a new sense of purpose, his mind racing with all that Andrea had shared. She had given him more than an apology. She had given him the gift of perspective. And now, it was up to him to make sure that he never made the same mistake again. The weeks that followed the meeting with Andrea Mason marked a profound shift in Judge Thompson's life. He had come to realize that the conversation he had shared with Andrea wasn't just a simple exchange of words. It was the beginning of a transformative journey. Her story, her resilience, and her willingness to offer him understanding had opened his eyes to the depth of the biases he had unknowingly carried for years. Every day in the courtroom, Judge Thompson found himself more aware of the way he viewed those who appeared before him. No longer did he simply look at the surface, at the clothes they wore, their demeanor, or their background. Instead, he began to ask himself deeper questions. Who were these people really? What challenges had they faced? What stories were hidden beneath their circumstances? He found himself considering their lives in ways he never had before. and in doing so, he became a better judge. The changes didn't stop in the courtroom. Thompson began to make intentional efforts to learn more about the people and communities he had been so distant from. He attended seminars on racial equity and diversity, sought out books that challenged his worldview, and spoke with activists and community leaders about the systemic issues affecting marginalized groups. He began to understand how deeply ingrained biases could shape not just individual decisions, but entire systems of power. And he understood how, in his position, he had been part of that system. Meanwhile, Andrea Mason continued her work, building her tech empire, funding initiatives that fought for racial justice, and advocating for better representation in industries where people like her had long been excluded. But despite her busy schedule, she never turned her back on Thompson. She had received his letter of apology with grace, but it was the meeting that had solidified her belief in second chances. She saw in him the potential for change, and she believed that he had the capacity to grow, just as she had against the odds. Not long after their meeting, Thompson received an invitation from Andrea. She was hosting a charity event for one of the initiatives she had launched to provide scholarships for young women of color pursuing careers in technology. The event would bring together influential figures from the tech world, as well as community leaders, activists, and philanthropists. Andrea had invited him not as a judge, but as a person, someone who had been on a journey of his own. Judge Thompson, the invitation read, "I hope you can join us as a guest. Your presence would mean a lot to me, and I believe it could be an opportunity for you to see firsthand the work we're doing to create a more equitable future." Thompson knew this was another opportunity, a chance to witness firsthand the incredible work Andrea was doing and to continue his path of understanding and growth. He accepted the invitation without hesitation, determined to support Andrea in any way he could. The evening of the event, he stood among hundreds of guests at a luxurious venue, but there was nothing about the atmosphere that made him feel out of place. He had changed. He was no longer just an observer. He was now someone actively participating in the work that needed to be done. As Andrea spoke to the crowd about the importance of education, opportunity, and the power of diversity, Thompson could see the passion and commitment in her eyes, the same determination that had fueled her rise to success, the same fire that had ignited her to make the world a better place for those who had been left behind. After the speech, Andrea approached him with a warm smile. "I'm glad you came, Judge," she said. "You've been more than open-minded about all this, and it means a lot." Thompson smiled back, humbled by her words. "I've learned a lot from you, Andrea, more than I ever expected. I can't undo the mistakes of the past, but I can move forward differently. I can be better." And he meant it. He wasn't the same man who had dismissed Andrea that fateful day in the courtroom. He had learned that justice wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about seeing people for who they were, understanding their struggles, and using whatever power you had to make a difference. As the night went on, Thompson found himself talking with others who shared similar stories, people who had faced adversity, who had fought for justice in their own ways. He listened more than he spoke, learning from their experiences, understanding the world in a way he never had before. And as he looked across the room at the faces of those who had come together to support Andrea's cause, he realized something even more important. The work wasn't done. There was still so much to be done, and he was ready to be a part of it. For the first time in a long time, Judge Thompson felt like he was on the right path, a path where true justice meant much more than a verdict. It meant understanding, empathy, and a relentless commitment to fighting for equality. It meant learning to see people not as cases, but as individuals with unique stories, struggles, and triumphs. And as Andrea Mason looked on, watching Thompson engage with the people around him, she knew that in his own way, he was becoming part of the solution. And that, she thought, was the real power of second chances.